Dr. David Ikard is here and helping us. We're talking about the 70th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education case. That was the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision that was supposed to desegregate our public schools. Now, 70 years later, a new study out in the Washington Post says that schools are as segregated today as they were 30 years ago. And 1 in 3 Black folks say that desegregation did not help Black people. Dr. Ikard, given that we haven't made a lot of progress with this, desegregation, and that Black folks don't seem to care that much about it anyhow, where do we go? How do we move forward? And you mentioned that there are more private schools now than public schools. Should we have a focus and an energy on trying to desegregate public schools, or should we just acknowledge that it is what it is, and just try to get Black students in the best private schools that they can get into? Should we be pushing for school vouchers? We know that Republicans are big on school vouchers and giving parents federal dollars so they can go into private schools. It just begs the question to me as to where we should be as a community on this issue of education.
Man, that's a hard question. That's a big one, right?
It is.
Right. You always bring so much intensity with these questions, right? I mean, we could certainly. I think
I only ask the hard questions to my smartest guest.
Well, I'll take that.
Only to my smartest guest.
Absolutely. I think first and foremost, desegregation as a philosophy does not work because it's based on things that are sociologically proven to be inaccurate, which is this kind of idea that if you put different kinds of folks in the same room, in the same classroom, it will result in community bonding and what have you. That's just not what bears out in the stats. What we find is that, in fact, in some of the most desegregated schools, most diverse schools, the racism by whites is actually the highest, right? So in other words, putting bodies in similar spaces does not result in, this kind of kumbaya bonding. Beverly Tate wrote a book about that. Why all the white kids sit together in the cafeteria or something like that, where she tracks this particular kind of dynamic of segregationist thinking, right? So because our culture is still very much grounded in white supremacy, right? And white supremacy is grounded in, as Toni Morrison would say, the not me and the not free, right? So in other words, being Black, embodying Black is the opposite of success, is the opposite of access, is the opposite of intellectual and ethical, right? That's baked into the DNA of our culture. And so just putting bodies in classrooms doesn't actually penetrate or explode those internalized cultural dynamics. Now, to the question of well, what do we do about that? I think that's a much harder question. I think if this voucher system was designed that with kind of Black people in mind, which we know that it is not, that would not be a bad option for us. But here's how a lot of these voucher systems are designed, right? Let's say you get a voucher in a particular area and the school that you get the voucher in is 15, 18 miles away. Well, if you socially, economically, if you have a car and the flexibility in your job, it's no big deal for you to drive your child, right, to that school when there's going to be no access to busing, no public transportation, right? So you can just put your child in the car and drive them to school and pick them up. If you are African American, Black, right, you don't have the same kind of access to public transportation, same kind of access to cars and the like, that becomes a significant burden for you, a burden that actually makes it so that your child can't attend that school, right, in that way. So by having those kind of elements as part of the dynamic of those vouchers, it actually hides the ways in which those vouchers actually discriminate based on class and race, right? So that if it was a voucher system in which people could get because busing for Black people is crucial, right? Because it allows your
Mhm.
child to get to school, back and forth to school, without you actually having to take the expense or the time in order to do that. Whereas for white kids, it's not as crucial. And so those are the types of things that are problems with vouchers. And also those vouchers in a lot of states, they don't just create the economic dynamic for these people, these kids, to go to these private schools. They take that money, right? Those vouchers come from taking that money from the public schools and weakening the public schools, right? So it would be the case that the vouchers, which disproportionately are privileging white people, that would disproportionately advantage the white middle class and educated, are actually depleting the public schools, which the majority of black people go to. So it becomes a trick bag. I mean, and part of the challenge is that a lot of um, these schooling systems, these voucher systems, actually are controlled by people who have a deep and abiding investment in actually sending their kids to mostly or all white schools, right? So if we were actually talking about a situation
Mhm.
where people were truly, genuinely concerned with raising the level of education,
Mhm.
we're having a different conversation, right? So I think for black
Mhm.
people, and again, for somebody like myself, somebody like yourself, these kind of dynamics in terms of the cars and access or whatever become less of an issue. But for the majority of black people, it is a major issue. And so many of us, because of these particular kind of systems, will get left behind. Right. So I don't
Yeah. So David Bank, go ahead.
know what you're gonna say.
I was just saying, David Banks, he's the chancellor of the New York City schools, which is the largest school district in the country, pretty much agrees with you that just putting a black person in a chair next to a white person is not going to help that black person. He believes that black kids need to go to schools where they are in their neighborhoods, but they need more funding directed
Absolutely.
to those schools, the high poverty schools serving students of colors, and more opportunities for advanced placement courses, etc. But we know that school funding is, driven by your community. So, you're
Property tax.
taxed as a resident of a city. And if you live in a high income neighborhood of that city, your school generally is going to get more funding, more resources, and not to mention how parents come in and play a role, right? So the affluent parents, if the school doesn't have, a computer lab, they just pull all their resources and buy a computer lab.
Right. Do a
So what the
fundraiser.
school
Right.
board doesn't do, they fundraise and do that. So I don't, that sounds good in theory. Just put more money into poverty-stricken schools, but we've been trying that for a while too, and that hasn't worked out too well.
Well, I think part of the problem is that we pathologize our children and we pathologize, right, the curriculum. And so W.E.B. Du Bois said famously in Souls of Black Folks, he says, the unasked question that when white people are thinking about black people and these types of issues, he said the unasked question is, how does it feel to be a problem? Right? How does it? And I think when we come
Hmm.
at these issues with this kind of deficit thinking, where somehow our kids don't have the capacity to learn, or our kids are not interested in education, or our kids, we need some kind of special hand holding in order to be successful, it actually belies the reality. The reality that is that black kids perform at a very high level, primarily when there are black teachers in the classroom. But what we know is that there's a small percentage of black teachers in the classroom. We're talking about 5 to 7%. So the majority of these students are going to be taught by white teachers, right? And what we see in these school districts is whatever. When we have this kind of this racial disparity, where the people who are running the schools, the principal, the teacher, are white, black students are punished at a higher rate. They're giving in-school suspension. Um, the expectations for their academic excellence is lowered. They're discouraged a lot of times from taking advanced classes, so on and so forth. So when you create a pathologizing system,
Yeah, I'm sorry, Dr. Ikard, we are out of time. Yeah, this is such a big issue, and you're right. I did ask you this giant, huge, difficult question, and
All good.
being the brilliant professor that you are, you have been answering it. But I got to have you back. We've got to continue this conversation because it's such an
Certainly
interesting conversation. Because
important
a
conversation.
lot of parents are sitting at home figuring out, what to do, and we're going
All
to
right.
be voting this year in a presidential election. And this issue of school vouchers and school choice is on the ballot. But we are out of time. Thank you so much, Dr. Ikard. I will definitely have you back for us to continue this conversation.